It wasn't the presence of a portrait that stunned the palace that morning, it was its absence. Where Queen Camilla's image once hung in solemn tribute within Prince Philip's Memorial Hall, there now remained only an empty space. No announcement, no explanation. But within hours, whispers began to ripple through royal corridors. Princess Anne had acted, and this time, she hadn't asked permission. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was dismissed as a minor oversight, the kind of quiet adjustment that happens behind palace doors without consequence. But those who knew the rhythms of royal life immediately sensed something was off. The Memorial Hall was not just another room, it was a carefully curated sanctum, a space bound by tradition, memory, and unspoken rules that few dared to challenge. And yet, sometime between the final rounds of evening inspections and the early morning preparations, the portrait had vanished. No paperwork surfaced. No routine maintenance logs explained the removal. Instead, what followed was something far more telling: an unusual tightening of internal communication, as if the palace itself had drawn a breath and chosen to hold it. Staff members who entered the hall that morning reportedly paused longer than usual, their silence heavier than protocol required. There were no questions asked aloud, only exchanged glances and quiet recalculations. Within minutes, instructions were issued not to investigate openly, but to maintain discretion. That word, so rarely used with such urgency, carried its own weight. Discretion meant containment. It meant that whatever had happened was not meant to travel beyond certain walls. And yet, in an institution where silence often speaks louder than declarations, that very effort to contain only fueled speculation. Then came the whispers, subtle at first, almost reluctant. Names weren't spoken directly, but they didn't need to be. The pattern was familiar. When something decisive, something unapologetically firm occurred within royal grounds, one figure often stood behind it. Princess Anne, the woman known not for spectacle but for action, not for negotiation but for enforcement. And as the morning unfolded, those whispers grew steadier, more certain, threading their way through corridors and offices until they formed a quiet but undeniable consensus: this had her signature. What made it more unsettling was not just the act itself, but where it had taken place. Prince Philip's Memorial Hall was not subject to casual change. Every object within it had been placed with intent, reflecting a legacy that was both deeply personal and institutionally sacred. To alter that space, even slightly, was to engage with something far beyond aesthetics. It was to step into the realm of legacy where every decision carried meaning and every removal suggested judgment. And still, there was no official word, no clarification, no attempt to soften the growing tension. The absence of a statement did not calm the situation, it sharpened it. Because in the monarchy, silence is rarely neutral. It is often deliberate. And as the hours passed, that silence began to feel less like restraint and more like strategy, as if the truth behind the missing portrait was being allowed to surface on its own terms. But this wasn't a simple rearrangement, it was a calculated act tied to something far deeper than Dacre. Prince Philip's Memorial Hall was never meant to be political, it was designed as a sanctuary, a place where legacy stood untouched by modern rivalries. But when one portrait was placed there in 2023, some insiders quietly questioned whether the line between tribute and influence had already been crossed. To understand why its absence now feels so heavy, you have to understand what that hall represents, not in public statements, but in the quiet language of the institution itself. It was conceived not merely as a memorial, but as a controlled preservation of Prince Philip's presence, a space where his influence would remain unchallenged, unaltered, and above all, undiluted. Every detail within it was selected with care, not for decoration, but for meaning. The individuals represented there were not chosen for proximity to power, but for their connection to Philip's life, his service, and his unwavering commitment to the monarchy as a duty rather than a privilege. It was, in every sense, a closed narrative, one that told a specific story about legacy, discipline, and sacrifice. For a time, that narrative held firm. Those who entered the space understood its quiet authority. It wasn't a place for reinterpretation or personal influence. It was a fixed tribute, almost immune to the shifting dynamics of the present. But then came 2023, a year marked by transformation, by the reshaping of roles, and by decisions that carried both symbolic weight and subtle consequence. Following the coronation, the inclusion of Queen Camilla's portrait within that hall was introduced not as disruption but as continuity. At least, that was the official tone. Yet behind the formality, something far less certain began to take hold. There were no public objections, no visible resistance, but within certain circles, questions surfaced quietly. Not confrontational, not even fully formed, just a growing sense that something about the placement felt premature. Camilla's position within the monarchy had evolved rapidly, and while her presence at the heart of royal life was undeniable, the memorial hall was never meant to reflect current hierarchy. It was meant to honor legacy already secured, not influence still being defined. And in that distinction, subtle tension began to grow. Some insiders would later suggest that Princess Anne had taken particular notice of this shift, not in reaction, but in reflection. For her, the hall was never just a ceremonial space, it was sacred ground, governed by principles that did not bend easily to circumstance. She had spent a lifetime operating within those boundaries, understanding that legacy is not something granted by position alone, but something earned, protected, and ultimately preserved with precision. And so, while others may have accepted the change as part of a broader evolution, Anne reportedly viewed it through a far stricter lens. What made it more complex was that nothing about the decision appeared overtly improper. There were no breaches of protocol, no obvious missteps. And yet, in institutions built on nuance, even the most carefully presented decisions can carry implications that extend far beyond their surface. The placement of that portrait, quiet as it was, seemed to introduce a new interpretation of what the hall could represent, and for someone like Anne, that reinterpretation may have signaled something deeper. Not a mistake, but a shift. Not an error, but a precedent. And precedents, within the monarchy, are rarely taken lightly. They shape the future as much as they reflect the past, which is why the unease never fully disappeared. It lingered, subtle but persistent, beneath the surface of routine, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. Because if the hall was meant to stand as a fixed tribute to a legacy already complete, then any alteration, even one presented as respectful, risked opening a door that had long been kept firmly closed. And if the hall was sacred, then what Anne discovered next may have been, in her eyes, a violation. Long before the portrait vanished, something had shifted behind palace doors. Conversations grew shorter, meetings more guarded. And according to those watching closely, Princess Anne had begun asking questions that few were prepared to answer. At first, the change was almost imperceptible, buried beneath routine engagements and carefully maintained appearances. But within the inner workings of the monarchy, where tone matters as much as action, those subtle shifts carried weight. Anne was not known for unnecessary inquiry. She did not ask questions to speculate, she asked them to understand, to verify, to protect. And when she began revisiting conversations that others believed had already been settled, it signaled something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface. It wasn't confrontation. Not yet. It was something far more controlled, a quiet examination of boundaries that may have been crossed without acknowledgement. Reports began to circulate, cautiously and without confirmation, that Anne had turned her attention toward the protocols governing legacy spaces, those unspoken but rigid frameworks that dictate how royal history is preserved. She had always operated within those frameworks with unwavering precision, but now, insiders suggested, she was revisiting them with renewed intensity. Documents were reviewed, precedents quietly reconsidered. Not in public forums, not in formal declarations, but in controlled, deliberate conversations that seemed to leave others unsettled rather than reassured. At the same time, another force within the palace was gaining momentum. Camilla's influence, already established, appeared to be expanding not aggressively, but steadily. Her role in shaping the monarchy's modern image had become more visible, more defined. And while this evolution was presented as a natural progression, it did not go entirely unquestioned behind closed doors. Because with influence comes interpretation, and with interpretation comes the risk of altering meanings that had long been considered fixed. That is where the tension began to take shape, not as open disagreement, but as a quiet divergence in perspective. On one side stood an approach that embraced adaptation, a willingness to redefine certain traditions in order to reflect the present. On the other stood a far more rigid philosophy, one that viewed legacy as something to be preserved exactly as it was, intended, untouched by contemporary influence. And between those two positions, a line began to form. Not drawn publicly, not even acknowledged directly, but felt. Those familiar with the internal atmosphere would later describe it not as conflict, but as recalibration. A sense that roles were being subtly redefined, that influence was being redistributed in ways that were not formally declared but quietly understood. The phrase began to surface in hushed conversations. Lines were being quietly redrawn. No one claimed ownership of those words, yet they persisted, echoing through discussions that stopped just short of becoming confrontational. Anne's questions, then, were not isolated. They were part of a broader awareness, a recognition that something within the structure had shifted just enough to require attention. And the more she examined it, the clearer it became that the issue was not a single decision, but a pattern. A series of subtle changes that, when viewed together, suggested a gradual reshaping of how legacy itself was being handled. Not overtly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and that realization carried consequences, because Anne was not someone who allowed uncertainty to linger. When she identified a problem, she moved toward resolution quietly, precisely, and without hesitation. The questions were never meant to remain unanswered. They were the beginning of something else entirely. A process. A decision already forming beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would no longer remain contained. But questions soon turned into action, and Anne's response would be as decisive as it was silent. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just a directive precise, controlled, and irreversible. By the time most of the palace realized what had happened, the decision had already been executed. The portrait was gone. What makes the moment so striking is not how loudly it unfolded, but how deliberately it did not. There were no visible signs of dispute, no drawn-out exchanges, no effort to justify or explain. Instead, what insiders describe as something far more calculated, a decision made in full clarity, then carried out with the kind of efficiency that leaves no room for reversal. According to those familiar with the internal process, the instruction did not travel through the usual chain of prolonged approvals. It moved quickly, directly, and with unmistakable authority. Not rushed, but purposeful. As if the outcome had already been settled long before the action itself took place. The timing only deepened that impression. Early morning, when the palace is at its quietest, when movement is minimal and attention is still forming for the day ahead, that was when it happened. A moment chosen not for secrecy alone, but for precision. Few witnesses, fewer questions, the kind of controlled environment where an action can be completed before it has time to become a discussion. And by the time the hall reopened to its regular rhythm, the change had already been absorbed into reality, leaving those who encountered it to process what they were seeing rather than prevent it. Staff involvement, by all accounts, was limited and carefully managed. Those who carried out the directive were reportedly given clear instructions, not only about what needed to be done, but about how it should be handled afterward. Silence was not implied, it was required. This wasn't framed as an extraordinary event, but neither was it treated as routine. It occupied a space in between, where the importance of the action was understood without being openly acknowledged. And in that space, discretion became more than protocol. It became part of the decision itself. What's equally telling is how the move has been described by those closest to the situation. Not as removal in the emotional sense, not as retaliation or rejection, but as something far more measured, a correction. That word has surfaced repeatedly, quietly, but consistently, suggesting that from Anne's perspective, this was never about conflict. It was about alignment, about restoring something that, in her view, had shifted away from its intended purpose. And within the rigid framework of royal tradition, a correction carries a very different meaning than a punishment. It implies necessity. It implies authority grounded in principle rather than reaction. Still, the absence of overt emotion does not diminish the weight of the act. If anything, it amplifies it. Because in a system where every gesture is layered with meaning, restraint often signals something stronger than confrontation ever could. Anne did not argue the point. She did not publicly challenge the decision that had placed the portrait there. She simply acted, and in doing so, redefined the situation without ever needing to address it directly. And that is where the real impact begins to unfold. Because when an action is taken this cleanly, this quietly, it leaves behind no visible, conflict-only consequences. The kind that ripple outward, reshaping perceptions, forcing recalculations, and quietly shifting the balance of influence without a single word being spoken aloud. But in a palace built on symbolism, even a silent correction can echo like a declaration of war. By midday, the silence had fractured. Not publicly, but internally, the reaction was immediate. Alliances stiffened. Questions flew. And at the center of it all stood a single, unavoidable truth. This had not been cleared through the usual channels. What had begun as a quiet absence was now impossible to contain within whispers alone. The palace, so carefully structured around order and hierarchy, found itself adjusting to something that had bypassed both. And within that realization came a wave of reaction controlled on the surface, but undeniably charged beneath. Those aligned with Queen Camilla were among the first to feel the shift. Reports suggest that her circle, accustomed to navigating influence with careful precision, was caught off guard not just by the act itself but by its execution. There had been no prior indication, no negotiation, no opportunity to respond. Just a decision already carried out, leaving them to confront its implications after the fact. Frustration, according to those familiar with the internal atmosphere, did not erupt openly. It tightened instead, contained within conversations that grew sharper, more urgent. The question was not simply why the portrait had been removed, but how such a move had been allowed to happen without consultation. Because within the monarchy, process is power. And when process is bypassed, it signals something far more significant than disagreement. It suggests authority being exercised in its most direct form. At the center of this unfolding tension stood King Charles, placed in a position that was as personal as it was political. On one side, his wife, whose presence and role within the monarchy had been carefully established over years of transition. On the other, his sister, whose authority was rooted not in position alone, but in decades of unwavering adherence to tradition. And between them, a decision that had not been brought to him beforehand, yet carried consequences he could not ignore. Insiders suggest that this was not a moment for immediate resolution, but for careful navigation, a recognition that any response would carry weight far beyond the issue itself. Meanwhile, senior aides moved quickly, though not visibly, to stabilize the situation. Language was chosen carefully. Narratives were adjusted before they could fully form. The goal was not to deny what had happened, that would have been impossible, but to shape how it was understood internally. Was this an overreach? A correction? A signal? The answers were not agreed upon, and that lack of consensus only deepened the underlying tension. Because when interpretation varies, alignment becomes fragile. What began to emerge was a quiet, but unmistakable divide. Not one declared in formal terms, but one felt through tone, through positioning, through the subtle alignment of perspectives. On one side stood those who believed the monarchy must evolve, adapt, and reflect the realities of the present. On the other, those who viewed such adaptation as a risk to the very foundation that had sustained the institution for generations. Traditionalists and modernizers, labels rarely spoken aloud, yet increasingly understood within the context of this moment. And beyond the palace walls, the first signals of unrest began to surface. Nothing explicit, no official confirmation. But in the world of media, where attention is drawn to even the smallest deviation from routine, the absence of clarity became a story in itself. Subtle shifts in coverage, carefully worded observations. A sense that something significant had occurred, even if its full shape remained hidden. The silence, once protective, was now becoming a source of curiosity. And as those signals grew stronger, so too did the pressure within. Because silence can only hold for so long before it demands interpretation. And in this case, that interpretation would not remain confined to private corridors. It would move outward, shaping perception, raising questions, and forcing the monarchy to confront not just what had happened, but what it meant. And as tensions escalated, attention turned to the one figure who could not remain neutral. For King Charles, the moment was deeply personal and dangerously political. His wife on one side, his sister on the other. And looming above it all, the enduring shadow of his father's legacy. What made the situation so delicate was not simply the decision itself, but the way it reached him after it had already been carried out. after the consequences had already begun to ripple through the institution he now led. Reports suggest that Charles became aware not through formal briefing, but through the same quiet channels that had carried the news across the palace. And that detail alone mattered. Because for a monarch, timing is not just procedural, it is symbolic. To learn of such a decisive act after its execution was to be placed in a position where response had to be measured, not immediate. Complicating that response was something far more personal: his own condition. Since early 2024, Charles had been navigating ongoing health challenges that, while managed, inevitably shaped how he approached moments of internal strain. Insiders often describe his current state not as weakened in authority, but constrained in capacity. The energy required for confrontation, for prolonged negotiation, for direct intervention, these are not small demands. And in a moment where every decision carried emotional and institutional weight, restraint became not just a choice, but a necessity. Yet restraint did not mean indifference. Those close to the situation suggest that Charles understood exactly what the removal represented, both in action and in implication. On one side stood Camilla, his partner, his support, someone whose position within the monarchy had been hard-earned through years of public scrutiny and gradual acceptance. To allow her influence to be quietly diminished, even symbolically, was not a simple matter. It touched on loyalty, on shared history, on the careful balance they had built together. On the other side stood Anne, unyielding, precise, and deeply rooted in the traditions that defined the institution long before Charles inherited it. Her authority did not come from visibility, but from consistency. She had always operated as a stabilizing force, someone who did not challenge the system, but enforced it with unwavering clarity. And that made her actions difficult to dismiss. Because if Anne had moved, it was almost certainly with conviction, guided by principles she believed were being tested. Caught between these two forces, Charles faced a choice that was less about action and more about positioning. To intervene directly would risk escalating a situation that had, until now, remained contained. To challenge Anne's decision would be to question the very framework she had spent decades upholding. And to openly support it could be perceived as distancing himself from Camilla at a moment when unity was expected. Every option carried consequence. Every silence carried meaning. And so, according to those familiar with his approach, he chose the path that demanded the most discipline. He said nothing. Not publicly. Not immediately. A silence that was not passive but deliberate. In doing so, he allowed the situation to settle within its own weight, to reveal its implications without forcing a premature resolution. It was a strategy rooted in patience, but also in recognition that some moments within the monarchy are not meant to be resolved quickly. They are meant to be absorbed, understood, and only then addressed, if at all. Hovering over that decision, however, was something far more enduring: the memory of Prince Philip himself. This was not just any space that had been altered. It was a memorial tied directly to Charles' father, to a legacy defined by discipline, service, and an uncompromising view of duty. And that connection could not be ignored. Because whatever disagreements existed in the present, they were being measured against a past that carried its own authority. In that sense, the issue extended beyond relationships. It reached into the core of what the monarchy represents, how it defines its own history, and who ultimately holds the responsibility of protecting it. Charles understood that better than anyone, which is why his silence, far from being an absence of leadership, may have been its most careful expression and acknowledgement that this moment required not reaction but reflection. But this wasn't just about family, it was about what the monarchy chooses to preserve and what it quietly removes. In royal life, nothing is ever just symbolic, because symbolism is everything. And removing a portrait from a memorial space isn't an act of decoration. It's a statement. One that doesn't need words to be understood. What makes this moment so charged is not the act itself, but the meaning layered beneath it. Because within the monarchy there is a profound difference between relocation and removal. Relocation suggests adjustment, a shift in placement without altering significance. It allows for reinterpretation, for flexibility, for the quiet evolution of narrative. But removal, true removal, carries a far sharper implication. It signals rejection of placement, a decision that something no longer belongs within a specific context. And when that context is tied to legacy, to memory, to something considered untouchable, the meaning becomes impossible to ignore. This is where interpretation begins to divide. For some, the act appears as a form of protection, a necessary step to preserve the original integrity of Prince Philip's memorial space. A reaffirmation that certain areas within the monarchy must remain fixed, immune to the shifting dynamics of the present. In that reading, the removal is not personal. It is structural, a reinforcement of boundaries that ensure legacy remains exactly as it was intended. But for others, the interpretation moves in a different direction. Because even when framed as preservation, such a decisive act inevitably reflects power. It shows who has the authority to define meaning, who decides what belongs, and who ultimately shapes how history is presented. And it is within that tension between protection and assertion that the deeper significance begins to emerge. Because this was not a public act. It was not explained, not contextualized, not softened through official language. It existed entirely within the private machinery of the monarchy, where decisions are made without the need for external validation. Yet the impact does not remain private. It extends outward, influencing perception, raising questions, and quietly reshaping how the institution is understood from the outside. That contrast between what happens behind closed doors and what is seen beyond them has always defined the monarchy. A carefully balanced duality where the public image is managed with precision while the internal reality operates according to its own logic. And in moments like this, those two worlds briefly intersect. The absence of a portrait becomes more than an internal adjustment, it becomes a signal, however subtle, that something within the structure has shifted. History offers its own context here. The monarchy has long relied on what could be described as silent corrections, actions taken without announcement, yet understood by those who know how to read them. Titles quietly adjusted, appearances subtly limited, symbols repositioned without explanation. These are not acts of randomness. They are part of a system that communicates through implication rather than declaration. And each one reinforces a central idea that legacy is not static, but it is fiercely controlled. Because legacy spaces, especially those tied to figures like Prince Philip, are not simply commemorative. They are guarded, carefully, deliberately, and sometimes uncompromisingly. They represent not just memory but meaning. And that meaning is not open to reinterpretation without consequence. Which is why even a single alteration can carry the weight of something far larger than itself. In that sense, what happened here is not isolated. It fits into a pattern, one where the monarchy protects its core narrative with quiet precision, even when doing so creates tension within its own ranks. The act may appear small from the outside, but within the system, it resonates. It forces reconsideration. It redraws understanding. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds everyone involved that nothing within that structure is ever truly permanent unless it is protected. And in the end, the silence surrounding the act may be its most powerful message. No announcement was ever made, no explanation offered. Yet within palace walls, everyone understood what had happened. The portrait was gone, and with it, a quiet line had been drawn. In the days that followed, something remarkable took place, not in action, but in absence of it. The palace did not erupt. There were no visible fractures, no public acknowledgements of tension. Instead, everything appeared to return to normal. Engagements continued. Statements were released. The rhythm of royal life moved forward with its usual precision. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, a recalibration had begun. Subtle, controlled, and deeply intentional. Because while nothing had been said, everything had been understood. Within internal circles, the shift was unmistakable. The boundaries that had once felt flexible were now clearly defined. The questions that had lingered were no longer open for interpretation. And at the center of that clarity stood Princess Anne, not louder, not more visible, but more firmly positioned than before. Her role, long associated with discipline and unwavering adherence to tradition, had been reinforced without a single declaration. She had acted, and in doing so, had reminded the institution of something it rarely needs to say aloud: that tradition, once challenged, will always find its defender. For Camilla, the implications were more complex. There was no direct confrontation, no visible reduction in status, no formal acknowledgement of loss. And yet, the shift could be felt, not in titles or appearances, but in influence, in how decisions would be approached moving forward, in how space, both literal and symbolic, would be defined. It was not a removal of presence, but a redefinition of boundaries. A quiet reminder that within the monarchy, position does not always determine permanence. What makes this moment so powerful is how it reflects one of the institution's most enduring principles, the idea that legacy outweighs individuality. Not as a statement, but as a practice. Decisions are not made to serve personal narratives. They are made to protect continuity, to preserve a structure that extends far beyond any single figure within it. And when that structure is perceived to be at risk, the response is rarely dramatic. It is precise, controlled. There is a certain discipline in that approach, one that resists the urge to explain or justify. Because explanation invites debate, and debate invites division. Silence, on the other hand, allows meaning to settle without interference. It forces those within the system to interpret, to adjust, to realign without being told exactly how. And in that silence, power reveals itself not through force, but through certainty. As time moves forward, the moment will not be revisited publicly. It will not be dissected or formally recorded in the way other events might be, but it will remain quietly embedded within the memory of those who witnessed its impact. A turning point not marked by conflict, but by clarity. A reminder that within the monarchy, control is not always visible, but it is always present. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth of all. That in a system built on history, where every gesture carries meaning, the most decisive actions are often the ones that leave no trace except understanding. No spectacle, no statement, just a shift felt, acknowledged, and never forgotten. Because in the House of Windsor, what is removed in silence often speaks louder than anything ever said aloud. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.